Thank you, Maya. And I just want to acknowledge also Phil's leadership over the past 9 years, and thank you for the leadership of the organisation, and also want to welcome Yasmina as the new president of Refugee Council of Australia. I'm talking to you all today from my home here in Western Sydney. I'm on Darug country, and I want to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So as Maya mentioned, this part of the AGM is actually a forum. So the topic is from sharing the microphone to working in partnership, NGOs and the emergence of refugee-led advocacy. So there's three elements. One is we're going to actually go back in time and travel through, there's a video that we've created to talk about refugee-led advocacy that RCOA has been involved in. We'll discuss the Refugee Alternatives Conference outcomes, and then there'll be a panel where I'll be joined by board members Yasmina and Malika. And there is actually opportunity for questions. We've gone through the agenda really fast, so we actually have an hour for this part of the agenda. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat and we will do our best to get through as many of the questions as possible towards the end. As has been highlighted earlier, the Refugee Council of Australia has been working to increase representation of people with lived experience of forced displacement in advocacy. We've recorded a video which captures some of our work and the impact it's had on individuals and the broader refugee rights movement as a whole. So we're going to share that video for you now. It is about 18 minutes and it does feature some of the people who've been involved in that work and also what we've done in the past 18 years. So Beck, are you able to share the video for us, please? Hi, everyone. I'm just not sure what's happening with the video. So what we're going to try to do is just swap the agenda items a little bit. We'll try to come back to the video at the end and hopefully it'll work. It'll work towards the end of this particular session. So we'll just get you to stop sharing your screen, Beck. Cool, thank you. So this didn't happen during our practice run. Everything was perfect, but as always, the practice run, things always don't go to plan. So I think what I'll talk about now is the Refugee Alternatives Conference report. For the past 5 years, the Refugee Council has hosted the annual Refugee Alternatives Conference. The conferences aim to centre the voices of refugees and people seeking asylum. And what our planning process is usually involves an advisory group of people with lived experience, talking to us about emerging issues and priorities for refugee communities. Now, those emerging issues actually form the program for the conference. And the majority of our speakers are of lived experience and they're presenting alternatives to policy, programs and services. So this year for our conference, over 70% of our speakers were themselves either refugees or people who were seeking asylum. The conference was held on the 6th and 7th of July in partnership with the Whitlam Institute within Western Sydney University. And, as was mentioned before, planning a conference during a pandemic is not an easy task. We had planned to have it as a hybrid conference, and 2 weeks before the conference, we had to switch from hybrid to completely virtual. And I think I'm very proud of the conference team. We rose to the challenge and we did a remarkable job of flipping the conference. And we held what I felt was a very, very good high caliber conference. We had people participating from all across the world. And actually the online format meant that we could have participants who may not have been able to travel to Sydney to participate in the conference. We had 335 delegates participate in 11 sessions. And to my understanding, that's the second highest number of delegates we've had at a Refugee Alternatives Conference. The theme for this year was Rebuilding Resilience and Innovation. The speakers talked about and really celebrated the incredible and challenging work of navigating a pandemic, but also acknowledged the contribution of refugee communities had in responding to the pandemic, both here in Australia and overseas. Really, we talked about during the conference the opportunities this presents and the important role refugee communities have in developing solutions. There was a push to not accept the informal nature of refugee-led advocacy. Delegates were challenged to think about how they can resource refugee-led advocacy so it isn't reliant on volunteer labour alone. There was so many emerging themes in the conference, but I'll share with you a couple, and of course I'll let you read the report yourself so you can see all the other things emerging. One thing that came out really strongly was a need to reframe how refugees are discussed and presented. Too often the capabilities, resilience and contributions are ignored, and rather with the terms of vulnerability and victims is what is used. And we know there's so much more to refugees and those words. So I encourage you all to have a read of the report. It is actually it's just been uploaded to the website, and I will just put the link in the chat so you can have a look at that if you bear with me 1 second. So that conference report is actually available now for everyone to see. Similar to previous conferences, we received positive feedback about the relevance of the dialogue and the unique perspectives refugees and people seeking asylum bring into policy alternatives. So from the feedback, it was clear that these conversations need to be occurring more than once a year. So I'm really, really pleased to announce that the Refugee Alternatives Conference, Refugee Alternatives will move from an annual conference to a regular series of policy and practice seminars, which will be held multiple times a year. This change will provide more opportunities to have dialogue on current issues. The online format will also provide opportunity for inclusion of refugees in Australia and those residing overseas. So our first policy and practice seminar will be in the new format, will be held in the first quarter of 2022, and we do hope you can join us in this new format for Refugee Alternatives Conference. So the report is available. I guess this is an unofficial launch. I'm not sure how you launch a report online, but I guess the report is available, and we do hope that you take a chance to read it in full and see the key themes emerging from that. I want to acknowledge all the partners and the sponsors and the speakers themselves for the amount of work that went into planning the conference, and also really challenging us as conference delegates to really rethink how we approach refugee policy issues and improve our practice as people working in the sector. Okay, so that's the conference part of it. Now I'd like to really talk about refugee-led advocacy. Bill's mentioned it before, and Phil's mentioned it before. And this part really is a panel discussion. And I've got two formidable women who are going to join me to talk about refugee-led advocacy and give both from personal and professional experience in this space. So firstly, I've got Dr. Malika Sheikh Eldin. Malika is a former refugee from Eritrea and a settlement service leader in Victoria. Malika has a PhD in aquatic science and has worked for over 15 years in the settlement sector. She currently works with AIMS in Victoria. Malika has been on the RCOA board since 2007. She has presented at sessions at UNHCR NGO and the annual tripartite consultations on refugees in Geneva and in other international conferences. She's a member of the gender audit team at UNHCR and was a refugee representative of the Global Summit of Refugees and Asia Pacific Network of Refugees. Also joining me on the panel is Yasmina Baraktarovich-Haywood. Yasmina is a Community Services Coordinator at New South Wales Service for the Treatment and Rehabilitation of Torture and Trauma Survivor, or STARTS for short. She's worked there since 1994. Yasmina came to Australia in 1993 as a refugee from Bosnia-Herzegovina. She's a trained social worker, and her involvement in the refugee field dates back to 1991 when she became involved in work with Bosnian refugees in Croatia. Her knowledge and expertise range from individual trauma counselling, group work, community development and management. She's got considerable experience in governance, having been on the board of many organisations such as Maya New South Wales, Karitani, Refugee Communities Advocacy Network, Western Sydney Area Health Service and Immigrant Women Speak Out, just to name a few. So welcome Yasmina and Malika.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll start off, I guess, this panel by asking you a question, Malika. On what people haven't seen, unfortunately, is a part of the video where Paul talks about your role as a delegate at the UNHCR consultations. Can you share with us how you got involved in refugee advocacy?
Thank you, Adama, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, on behalf of myself refugees, people of refugee background and asylum seekers, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, of the land where we are all meeting, and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to all elders who are attending this AGM with us. My name is Malika Sheikh Eldin, and originally I am of refugee background from Eritrea. I have been involved in refugee advocacy since I became a refugee in 1979. First, as a student and women's advocate in refugee camps in Sudan, teaching in refugee secondary schools, and raising awareness about the just cause of my people's struggle. Then, volunteering with UNHCR, Red Cross, and other NGOs. Later in Egypt, I volunteered at the St. Andrews Refugee Services. After arriving in Australia in 1992, I joined the leadership of a number of community organizations. I have served in the Eritrean Community Association, the Horn of African Communities Network, the African Professional Association, the Diaspora Action Australia, and the National Refugee-Led Advocacy and Advocacy Group. After completing my PhD at Deakin University, I started working with AIMS Australia, becoming involved in refugee settlement, particularly with regional settlement of refugees in Victoria. In 2007, I was elected to the board of the Refugee Council of Australia as an organizational representative, where I have learned a lot from the vast experience of board members on governance and advocacy techniques. But I have also shared my personal refugee experience, my knowledge about refugee communities in Australia, and issues affecting those communities. In 2007, I traveled to Geneva for the first time to attend the UNHCR NGO consultations as part of a small group of refugee representatives. And that was supported by Refugee Council of Australia and the University of New South Wales. The 5 of us refugees from Australia were among the only refugee representatives present out of more than 300 delegates from around the world. Realizing the importance of the voice of refugees being heard at the international level, I began attending these consultations and annual tripartite consultations on resettlement on a regular basis, supported by AIMS Australia. My presentations resulted in me being invited to be part of the UNHCR multicultural disciplinary mission to Sudan, back to where I was originally a refugee, to apply the heightened risk identification assessment tool developed by the Center for Refugee Research, University of New South Wales. I have also visited New Zealand and Japan to share my experience in refugee resettlement. In 2012, the Refugee Council co-hosted a global work group on resettlement meeting in Melbourne, and many community guides of refugee background were involved in the preparation of this important event. One of the recommendations from this meeting was that all future meetings of the ATCR should include refugee representatives. Today, the Refugee Steering Group helps to, which is made up of all refugees. They help to plan ATCR meetings, and I am proud to be part of that group as well. Through the University of New South Wales, I also became involved in the UNHCR Refugee Women's Dialogue in Jordan in 2011, and for several years I have been part of the UNHCR Gender Audit Team, working to ensure that the concerns of refugee women and girls are not ignored. And I'll be continuing this.
Thank you, Malika. That's 40 years. As I remember you said 1979, so that's over 40 years of advocacy at a local and international level. I want to thank you for your contribution and supporting refugee advocacy for so many years. I think my reflection of what you've said, that it's clear the role, that personal perspective you brought to your advocacy is crucial in the refugee rights movement, that you're able to influence at the international level, perhaps even at the local level, based on your experience, that personal lived experience you have. And I think that, it's quite crucial for us to make sure that refugees have a voice at all levels. Yasmina, I'll go to you next. You've been involved in refugee advocacy yourself at a personal level, but I've also watched you from afar support numerous refugee-led organisations. What are your observations when it comes to supporting refugee-led organisations?
Thanks, Adama. I mean, this is something that I could probably talk about for a day or two, but I think we'll shorten it for today. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I live and work, the Darug people. This is and will always has been Aboriginal land. In terms of my observations, I know how good refugee communities and leaders who I've worked with are at bending this arc. And I've seen that firsthand many a time. And I do acknowledge also that there's much more to us, people of refugee background, than just being issues and being victims. There has been a time of victimhood, but we have all moved towards a time of survival and towards the space where we have survived and thrived. So the observations really go to a couple of points. One is that refugee communities, organizations and groups do have significant skills. So they have knowledge, they have experience, and that knowledge, experience, and skills on people's unique understanding of their own life stories, those skills and knowledge have to inform the advocacy. We also have to acknowledge that there are absolutely exceptional leaders in the communities that I had the privilege and honor to work with. I mean, some of them are here. John Rock from Australian Karen organization and Arcan, who I worked very closely with. Hi, John. Philip's community has once been in that position, Philip Feinstein and Music for Refugees. And then I don't know if Tina is here, Tina Dixon from Forcibly Displaced People's Network, the only LGBTIQ refugee-led organization in Australia. So there are exceptional people in refugee communities. The refugee communities and leaders might need some support to engage with Australian media, systems and politicians and drive the advocacy efforts themselves. But those are the skills that can be learned. The lived experience is not something you can learn through a workshop. Lived experience is something you bring with you. So it is up to organizations such as RCOA and STARTS, who I work with, to support that learning process. In the past, I mean, I have witnessed the refugee advocacy efforts where the assumption was made that because people don't understand Australian systems, they can't take the center stage in self-advocacy. Thus, and that is about forgetting that not knowing Australian systems doesn't mean you don't have anything to say and you don't have a deep understanding of your own life story, of your needs, strengths, and challenges. But there are also times, and the other thing that I've learned is that there are times when refugee communities need support to challenge some internal social norms and develop the capacity to advocate on behalf of smaller subgroups within their communities. And that will be potentially people with disabilities, but also people with diverse gender, sexualities, and bodies. It has been a challenge for many refugee communities as well, which is why the group that Tina and other people have created is incredibly important. I just want to also say that some community leaders, and give that acknowledgement, are actually fantastic at straddling multiple cultures and creating this bridging social capital between their communities and between the wider Australian world. And it is these people who are, I guess, in a way, interpreters of their community's knowledge and skills. And yeah, they need to be supported. And I have worked with many of them.
Yes.
Adama, is that?
Yes, and I've seen you do it very, very well. So I think one of the things that we've been reflecting on, and when I say we, I mean that in the broader sense of the refugee rights movement sector, is how we can include refugees in a meaningful way in advocacy, but also in campaigns work. So I think I guess I'm seeking advice from two women who over 40 years of experience have been doing this and have made some, have done it well. What is your advice for anyone who's listening today, for organisations seeking to include refugees in their advocacy work? What are some of the key things that they need to do to ensure that it's done in a meaningful way?
Malika.
Okay. So I think, my advice is, first of all, representation of refugees not to be tokenistic.
Mm-hmm.
So give those refugees a chance to have a role in decision making. Secondly, give refugees a voice to reflect the challenges facing refugees and be part of the solution. Provide refugees proper mentoring and help them to direct, share, and present their lived experience and knowledge about refugees to positively influence governments, NGOs, and mainstream community views about refugees by building their capacity in advocacy and self-representation. Also to help them build networks with relevant services and institutions so they can have good understanding of Australian laws and regulations. Mm-hmm. And I think, this will really help, refugees to be more involved and be part of the real advocacy.
Fantastic. Thank you, Malika. Yasmina, what are your thoughts on what organisations can do?
Well, look, it all starts with listening and true listening and learning through that listening. And as we listen, we also have to reflect on our own privilege and how our privilege in this society shapes our policy and advocacy priorities and approaches. And with that, I reflect on my own privilege as well, of the parents who are highly educated and coming from a European country. And the color of my skin affords me privilege, which then impacts on how I interpret things. The next thing is to use, we as organizations have got very strong linking social capital with people who, and organizations and politicians who have power to make decisions. And as we use that linking social capital, we need to use it to create spaces for refugee voices and then amplify those voices. Those of us who run organizations should really only take center stage if people on whose behalf we are speaking may be at some form of risk when doing so. But this is not about us taking the center stage. It is about creating a space where the center stage can be taken by people with lived experience. Also thinking about this is refugee communities are very diverse, like any other community. So one voice doesn't speak for all. So having a refugee representative on a committee doesn't necessarily mean that all refugee stories and voices will be represented. Next thing is to make sure you transfer your knowledge and build capacity. It's kind of okay to do one-off training, but one-off training is not all that's needed. There needs to be a consistent working with refugee communities and organizations over quite a lot of long time period and supporting them as they develop those skills and knowledge and engage with the systems. But remember that being invited to help build this capacity is actually grounded in a trust you have developed with the community. It is not something that happens overnight. The trust building takes time. And so you have to honor that trust. And the last thing that I've observed is importance of working with government to create consultation processes that actually facilitate direct input by refugee communities. Because how often have we had a call for a policy submission with 4 weeks notice? So only if you actually know how to engage with the system can you have a voice. So it means basically advocating with government to change the way they do things. So it could be face-to-face or Zoom engagement, sufficient time to actually make a meaningful contribution, opportunity to provide submissions in the first language, or government funding and working with refugee community organizations to obtain that input from their communities. So that would be my thoughts on it. I have more thoughts, but I don't think we have enough time for all my thoughts.
I'm taking notes. I'm taking notes on what we need to do to ensure we're meaningfully including people.
Thank you.
I did say that we do have time for questions. So if anyone does have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to respond to them in the time that we do have left. One of the things, and I feel this is one of my bugbears, I have to say, is the fact that refugee-led advocacy really is done in a volunteer capacity. We've seen the great work that organizations do, and whether it's at a local level right up to the national level, international level, the work is done on top of, you know, full-time job, family, community leadership and organisation management and all that work that's been done. And often there's opportunities missed because there's too much balls are being juggled and not, yeah. So I think that refugee-led advocacy is in a volunteer capacity, and often that places limitations on what communities can do because it's volunteer capacity and because people are dealing with so much. Question I have for the both of you, who I guess have done this both in a volunteer capacity, I've done it in a professional capacity, and they've also worked alongside many organisations who are doing it in a volunteer capacity, is what can we do as a sector, as people who either, whether we also volunteer with refugees or we are in organisations that may be able to change that. What can we do to change this current informal volunteering that's done by refugee advocates? What can we do? What are your suggestions?
I think, first of all, we have to understand that refugees, they are, settled refugees are new, and therefore they have got a big responsibility, to organize their lives and, having responsibilities of bringing up their children, supporting their families and relatives who are also, in refugee camps and so on. So their responsibility is not only here, but it is also, beyond that in refugee camps or in places where their families are scattered. So it's very important to understand. And unfortunately, sometimes you hear that people say, refugees don't want to volunteer, although it's their cause. The refugees volunteer almost every day within their communities. And therefore that has to be understood, and there has to be some kind of support. Most of their involvement is voluntary, so they have to have access to proper funding sources. Mm-hmm. The other thing is also they have to have access to education, training, and mentoring to supporting, their professional development, because, they come from different systems, and therefore they have to know what their role will be. How can they engage with mainstream? How can they engage with government and other advocates? Also, they have to have access to reliable transportation. Now, when we talk about transportation, it looks very easy, but most refugees, they are either working, in a very, low wage jobs, or they rely on welfare, and therefore, paying their tickets to go and meet other refugees who most of the time live in very, remote suburbs. It's very hard and it's time consuming. So I think, we have to consider whenever, we ask refugees to volunteer also, just support them with simple things like transportation and so on. Mm-hmm. The other thing is to nominate, some of those refugees for based on what they are contributing to promote them, so nominate them for awards, and also on local papers and also in social media. I think, also there has to be formal recognition and acknowledgement of their contribution, so they can be encouraged to continue this honorable task, and not to let them sit in the back seat when it matters, because that's, most of the time, you just promote others, while they will not be even mentioned. So I think, simple things like that can bring a lot of change.
Very good points there. I think recognizing the contribution, and I think the award system is one way that can be done, or through promotion of the actual activities, and as you mentioned, those resourcing and acknowledging what the load that they're already carrying are quite important things. Yasmin, I'll go to you, and I think we do have a question in the chat which I'll respond to after you've responded to this question.
Well, first of all, financial resources. Refugee community organizations need and should be able to access financial resources. So sometimes if a grant is available, rather than applying your organization, applying support the refugee community to apply for that funding, for that grant. Support the refugee-run organizations like APNO, which is what RCOA is doing, NRAG, ARCAN, and as Bettina's mentioned, the Forcibly Displaced People's Network. It's important to support those organizations and again, support access to resources through both advocacy with the government, but also through funding submission, writing and development. Find a way of compensating people for their lived experience and knowledge, academic expertise, policy expertise, professional expertise gets paid for, and I do this in my work time. The lived experience is often not recognized as just quite as important, and it certainly is. So there needs to be a way of compensating, and Malika has talked about that as well, even just for things like transport.
Yeah.
Make sure you employ people with lived experience and create career advancement pathways for them. So I'd like to say that Adama actually started at STARTS as a trainee counselor for African communities, and I'm really proud to see where Adama is now. I feel like a mother hen. My team, members of my team speak some 70 languages. We did a count recently, and I'm incredibly proud of that. And majority of them are people with lived experience, lived refugee experience. And so that, that's a way of acknowledging it. And in terms of awards, I'm proud to say that the Volunteer of the Year for Central Sydney is Mr. Karimi. He's an Afghan man from Australian Afghan Hassanian Youth Association. And I was very proud when he was called out as the Central Sydney Volunteer of the Year for the award, because that was acknowledgement of the tireless work he and Aya have been doing for many years.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's some thoughts.
Yep, fantastic. I think some really practical suggestions. I've taken notes. I hope everyone else has taken notes as well, because very practical things we all can do. I will just go to the comments, and I think I've got a couple people who've got their hands up. So I'll go to the comments first, and I'll go to those who've got their hands up. So I've got a comment here from Summer, who says there is value in newly arrived refugees being invited and trained and supported to join advocacy circles with their new and international perspectives on advocacy, rather than pushing or simulating to the current mainstream systems and processes of advocacy in Australia. Of course, and I think that, Summer's point really adds the fact that refugees bring with them a set of skills and knowledge that can contribute to what's already there and actually can potentially change how things are done. So that's really important. We do have a question from Phil, and I think I might see if Paul's able to answer this question. So Philip Feinstein has said, I'm part of one group advocating to the federal government to take more action to get Afghans resettled in Australia, especially those who helped out troops. What is Refugee Council doing in this area?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Thank you, Philip. Yeah, we're working on a number of fronts. I mean, as Professor William Maley alluded to before, obviously we're involved in the submission process, and Rebecca Eckhart has noted that one of our colleagues, Louise Olive and Muzaffar Ali from Chisara are Learning, are actually giving evidence to a parliamentary committee at the moment on Afghanistan. We've been very actively involved in writing on a number of occasions to every parliamentarian. In fact, our first letter to the Prime Minister and to every MP was on the day after the fall of Kabul. And then we were involved in working with 300 other organisations to put forward joint letters to parliamentarians. We've working behind the scenes with a number of organisations that from Afghan communities, from faith-based groups, and others who are involved in advocacy in doing, encouraging people to do whatever they possibly can to influence MPs, particularly coalition MPs. And so we've come up with a hit, working with others with a hit list of about 25 or so coalition MPs that we're trying to work with people who live in their electorates to influence. And so as a result of that, there's been a series of meetings taking place, including some people on the call here, who've been to see MPs in different states who are their local federal MPs to be able to try to influence the federal government's position. I'm also, as you'd be aware, on the government's advisory panel, which is the first time since the since we actually had the federal government funding cut that the federal government has actually included us in a formal panel of this kind. And we're working with 6 Afghan community members and 4 others from non-government organisations in providing advice behind the scenes to the Immigration Minister. So, and what I can see is, there's a very consistent message coming through all of this. It's about Australia having a substantial additional resettlement commitment for Afghan refugees, and also addressing, critically important issues such as temporary protection, and the situation of people in Australia who have, from Afghanistan, have bridging visas and don't actually have any level of protection, even temporary. And yeah, we're still very much in the hands of the Immigration Minister and the members of the Cabinet who are taking their time, really dragging their feet in coming up with a response. Yeah, and I think we just have to continue to apply the pressure in whatever way we can.
Thank you, Paul, for that. I've got Mukhlis. I apologise if I've said your name incorrectly. You've got a question.
Yes.
Contribution.
Yeah, you pronounced my name perfectly. Thank you so much. My name is Mukhlis Habash, representing Socio-Cultural Syriac Association, a refugee background association. Regarding your question about what advocate groups or volunteers asked for, what you can do, an association, a small organization like us, we are very keen to advocate for our community or refugees. So what we need is, there is 3 issues that I think is important. First is building organizational capacity, and that included knowledge and resources at the beginning, and also some training if applicable. Other thing is, what we need our voice to be heard, so that include media, to have access to a powerful media, the media that our voice can be reached to the politicians. And the other thing is to be involved in decision-making policies, and that include in consultation. And because we are working with refugees directly, we are listening from them, and we want, when any decision, any policy, any strategy, I think if we have make any contribution, that will be valuable, I think. And yeah, this is basically all an organization like us needed to be voice of refugees. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Mukhlis. I think you've hit the nail on the hammer. And coming from, I think you're the president of this organization, you've told us exactly what you need. And I think for those who are in the room and are in the position to support refugee-led organizations, we just need to now respond to that request that's come through. Before I go to you, Joseph, I've actually wanted to go to Louise. Dr. Louise Olive was mentioned earlier that she was actually presenting at the parliamentary inquiry, and she's been working alongside Muzaffar Ali to present on that. I just wanted her to share what that experience was like. Louise, are you with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Adama. And yeah, I guess listening to this conversation and just having come from a parliamentary hearing, it just reinforces the value of actually sharing in partnership the space to speak to decision makers, because Muzaffar was so brilliant. He's a brilliant advocate, full stop. But in that committee, they were asking questions that there's just no way I can answer. They asked questions about policy, which I could answer, but then they were asking questions about, how communities on the ground were dealing with conflict. And Muzaffar had spent the weekend calling his contacts in Uruzgan province in Afghanistan to ask them what the displacement situation looked like. And he was able to speak to the committee members about that. And they were so engaged in his contribution to that committee that I can't think of a better way to participate in something like that as to have somebody with that level of expertise and to be able to sit with and alongside them and to share that space. So Muzaffar wouldn't have been given that space, I don't think, without the Refugee Council having an invitation through our submission, but we wouldn't have been able to give the level of expertise without him joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Louise. I think you've really highlighted the importance of working alongside and then sharing space, sharing power when you do, giving them the space and opportunity to amplify their voices. Can I just ask you one more question? In working with Muzaffar, was there anything that particularly that you did so that he could feel comfortable? As like you said, he's an expert, quite skilled. Parliamentary inquiries may be new. Australian parliamentary inquiries may be new for him. So is there anything particularly that you did that to support him through that process so his voice could be amplified?
Well, certainly. I mean, I think part of it is that we have a relationship to begin with. I've worked with Muzaffar, and I know my colleagues have worked with Muzaffar for many years, so we know his capability and his expertise. But it was just having a phone conversation and an ongoing kind of conversation with him last week about what the hearing is, what it actually is an opportunity to do, how it's going to run. And, you know, like not everyone has been, and he called me after, he's like, that was really great. Like that was my first time doing that. And that was really fantastic because I think he understood that, you know, they were going to ask us questions. So we couldn't like set the agenda too much, but we had a strategy around how we could try and get across what we wanted to, and it worked, our strategy. And, you know, so that was what it took, just some like talking through the process and then, you know, coming up with also listening to what he wanted to say and how that kind of aligned a little bit with what they would expect from the Refugee Council as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think really practical ways that, again, an organisation as Refugee Council can actually share this power that we do have with the people with lived experience in organisations. I do have a hand up.
Just say, sorry, Adam, I just wanted to say, Louise wasn't there when I was speaking, but you did the trust and a relationship, you did the long-term support, you did creating a center stage and amplifying that center stage, you used your linking social capital to access the powers that be, and you listened. You did everything. You ticked my checklist.
Fantastic. I think that the video may not work. So what I actually wanted to do was, I'm going to go off script a little bit, and I hope you do forgive me, Joseph and Sama, for this, is to actually get the video, which was put together by our team, really shares the journey of some of our members and our staff in advocacy and representation at, you know, local and international level. But we will share the link afterwards. But I actually thought it might be more interesting to hear them talk directly. So Joseph and Sama, perhaps I will invite you to talk about, you know, perhaps what you would have said in the video, anything in addition to what's already been discussed in this forum so far.
Do you want to start with Sama first?
Okay, I like it. You got someone else in. That's fantastic.
It's just ladies first.
Thanks. I'm sorry I cannot open my video, but I'm happy to share some of the notes. What I said on the video was very brief. I'm basically introducing myself. My name is Sama. I'm the project officer. I work with RCOA. I work with the community engagement team. I first got involved with RCOA's work in, I think, early 2020. And it was a year after my arrival to Australia as a humanitarian refugee with my family. And I got involved basically as a storyteller, as a speaker for the face-to-face program. And that was my introduction to refugee advocacy here in Australia. I had no idea what that meant. I was a volunteer with different organizations, but basically working with the face-to-face, telling my story in different platforms, in community organizations, in corporate platforms, in schools, talking about the displacement journey and what that means, and sort of putting it in the context of what the global refugee conditions are. It was such an eye-opening experience, and it exposed me to advocacy that is familiar for me, because storytelling was something that I knew. It comes from my own background, my own traditions. It felt different from lobbying and petitions and writing the MPs and all the other strategies that I was that I had been exposed to. So that was the beginning. And then I got more involved with RCOA's work when I was offered a job to work on the conference, the Refugee Alternatives Conference. And that was an inspiring journey because it was, again, a platform for change in a way that I didn't even know existed. It was one of the first conferences that was, unique in the sense that it focused more on people with lived experience rather than on the academic and policy conversations. Those issues were addressed, but people leading the conversations were people with lived experience. In my role as someone who was planning and organizing and working the logistics in the background in the conference, I saw that there were a lot of principles that we were trying to apply in our work. So one of the main conversations that came up in the sessions for me, the emerging themes of the conference, was the theme of cultural safety and what that means for refugee advocates and refugees in this space. And I saw that in the planning of the conference because we were trying to look and reflect at our own policies and trying to make the environment safe and culturally appropriate for speakers and advocates from refugee background. One of the policies we implemented in the planning of the conference this year, which I'm very proud of, was that we compensated all speakers. We paid every speaker with lived experience for their time, for their expertise, and we treated them as cultural consultants. And that was really important for me as someone from a refugee background. And it was important because we were developing a relationship with our advisory and people with lived experience and expertise, and valued and respected what they bring to the conversation and the time and the effort they spend. And that goes back to what you were saying, Adama, about, moving away from the volunteering advocacy in the refugee space and more towards, making sure that lived experience is treated as an expertise rather than just, a person coming to legitimize a conversation or this tokenistic approach to advocacy. So yeah, that was my experience. I'm continuing to work with the Refugee Council. I'm inspired every day by the voices that I hear from refugee advocates and leaders in the sector. And this has been my experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Summer. I'll now go to Joseph, who also is featured in this video, and we will share the video after this meeting so everyone can watch it in its entirety. But I'll go to Joseph Yohana, who's actually one of our board members.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm Joseph Yohana. I'm a board member with the Refugee Council of Australia. Started, I think it was last year when we started with you guys. I'm also the community inclusion manager at the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence. I'm a former refugee from Iraq originally. Arrived to Australia. I'm not lucky like Samah. I arrived in 2006, so it's been a long time here for me. Started to work with the the settlement or refugee sector back in 2008, early 9, when I was given the opportunity to be a community guide, working under the umbrella of Malika's leadership. At that time, I remember in 2010, I was given an opportunity to speak about the refugees and the community guide program at the Refugee Conference in Sydney, where I met people from Refugee Council of Australia and other agencies. And then I remember I had other opportunities. One of them was the OSCO HSS conference that happened in Melbourne, where I was given, that theme that there are so many leaders and CEOs and senior managers from different sectors gathering on Melbourne to listen about how do we do a better OSCO training for Australians or newly arrived refugees. And at that time, I was doing something that I didn't know what does that mean, which is the advocacy. I didn't know the word of advocacy, to be honest. And I started to be receiving a proper coaching from people surrounding me, from managers and from leaders that I've met over the years. And I was given the opportunity more and more to highlight and feature my lived experience, where I started to attend the annual annual NGOs consultation, UNHCR NGOs consultation in Switzerland, part of the refugee representations, to travel there and to be privileged to speak on behalf of refugees. That advocacy was, fruitfully coming more and more, and being galvanized in my personality, which made me to realize that I need to do more work and proper work. And that led me to look after different profiles. Definitely the profile of youth was the role of the youth and the education on a global level, and how much we can do better work for the refugees from the youth backgrounds. And also the other opportunity was to start thinking, why don't we go back as a refugee advocates to the refugee camps? And we don't need only to travel on flights all the way from here to Geneva to speak about refugees while we don't feel what they have been feeling. So I've attended to twice, one to Lebanon and one to Iraq, to refugee field experience, to validate my passport as a refugee and to be able to speak on their behalf in a legit matter. And that made a different story for me, that it is not only that I was a former refugee, the refugee story is surviving in me, because I still remember that there is no electricity for someone to survive, and you don't have enough food on a table at the end of the day. As an Australian, we don't feel that. Even in the crisis in Australia, no one slept, without food. We are a very generous community here in Australia, but in refugee camps, the world is shrinking against them, and they kind of becoming a global crisis. The pandemic took a lot of highlights, but they are the global crisis, and it will continue in the coming years. And what I want to say, it's the testimonial to the Refugee Council of Australia. It's been a privilege to be with the RCOA for years. I think one of the things it gave me the platform to represent my community, to represent the story that I have and I hold. It helped me, Refugee Council of Australia, to connect me with the world. It was an opportunity for me through the connection with RCOA, Paul Power in particular, and others, to connect me with people on the ground in Lebanon, and what do I need to do there, and who can I see, and how can I go to around the fields, and also in Geneva, and the opportunity to speak at the annual tripartite consultations, and the conversation that we've been having. How do we have engagement of refugees on a global level? How do we make it meaningful? It's not about only being there and ticking boxes. It's about actually being around the table and change the policies and influence the decision makers about how much it's important to be there. And we've been successfully working on over the clock for the last 10 years. The number of refugees attending the NGOs consultation and the annual tripartite consultation has been amazing. The significant committees that we've been created from the influenced by Australian leadership and the APNOR and others, it's been significant, it's been recognized. I think we are troublemakers when we are on a global level.
Good troublemakers, Joseph, good troublemakers.
Good troublemakers. In every conference, I remember whoever is chairing the panels and opening plenaries and closing plenaries, they say, enough people from Australia, from the rest of the world, who want to talk? So we have started to have different strategies of how can we be in their different hats. So well done to RCOA for being very influential and strategic on being on a global level. I really congratulate RCOA, and I'm part of it. I think we need to recognize and celebrate that success. So well done, and keep the good work.
Thank you, Joseph. I think the one point I want to draw out is the important role diaspora communities have as well. Someone in the diaspora, and the important role you have in advocating for people in your homeland and the situation that they're in and experiencing. We do have 1 more minute left, and I think, being true, making sure I please my boss, I'll give him the last minute to speak. So I'll pass on to you, Paul, as to say, I guess, the final words for this. We did say we'd finish at 1:45, so I'll pass it on to Paul.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Adama, for the way in which you've handled that session. And I mean, it was ironic that the video failed, because that was our actual attempt to bring the content into a short period of time that we wanted to get across. And I'll encourage you to have a look at it because it just gives a little bit of an outline of the journey that we've had, in particular over the past 10 to 15 years, in learning the lessons that Louise really illustrated today, that you can go into, someone like me or Louise can go into a meeting with officials, with politicians, as well briefed as we possibly can be as outsiders. But having the depth of knowledge and being able to get information in the first language of people that are forcibly displaced is absolute gold in terms of advocacy. And one of the things which has surprised me over the years is how poorly that is understood by many NGOs, by many researchers and by many advocates. It's very obvious, but I saw this, when I started advocating alongside Malika, Sheikh, Eldin in Geneva, 14 or 15 years ago, that I had prepared everything I possibly could, on, the information that we were receiving from refugees about the situation in the Horn of Africa, but that and absolutely nothing in comparison to Malika's personal understanding and her personal knowledge about what was happening on the ground. And quickly I learned that the best role that an organisation like ours can play is to facilitate access that people from smaller refugee-led organisations, voluntary organisations might not necessarily have, but to be able to provide a platform to share the microphone with people who can speak, not only from direct personal experience, but also from the connections that they have with people who are still, right in the middle of, a serious forced displacement crisis. And I think it's been when I think of how things have changed over the years, it's really quite extraordinary. We couldn't get refugee-led organisations at the table, for instance, at the Australian government's NGO dialogue on refugee issues for quite some years. Recently, when I was contacted by Alison Larkins from the Department of Home Affairs and asked whether I'd be on the advisory panel, she said to me, my hope is that at least half of the panel members will be people with lived experience from Afghanistan. I couldn't believe it, that now, this idea that, it's gone well beyond, I hope, tokenistic inclusion of people to the point where there's a great understanding that the people who need to be talking about the situation in Afghanistan are people who are from Afghanistan themselves, who are in direct contact with people who are still stuck in the situation. So I think our collective advocacy has matured a lot. We've moved from creating opportunities for people to speak to what I hope is, a much more equal partnership and allyship, with people from refugee-led organisations. And now, recently our organisation, not only been involved in creating opportunities for refugee-led organisations by auspicing and supporting them, but we're actually now realising that we need to find ways as best we can of sharing some of the resources that we have with refugee-led organisations to be able to resource them and to be able to encourage other organisations to do that. And I know, Adama, in fact, I'll give you the final word, that you're working with Refugee Leadership Alliance, which is actually focused on that. And there's been some fantastic developments just in recent weeks on that, in that regard.
Sure. Okay. I'll talk about Refugee Leadership Alliance and then I'll close the meeting because we are over time. So thank you everyone for staying with us for so long. So the Refugee Leadership Alliance is a newly formed alliance, formed I think June, July this year. And the main purpose is to increase the influence, the networks and the funding to refugee-led organisations in Asia Pacific region. We had, our idea was to create a pilot funding pool where we would get funds from donors and then through the funds would go to the Asia Pacific Network of Refugees, and they then would refund to refugee-led organisations. So refugee-led to refugee-led organisations, the funding would be untied and would be core funding for the work of those organisations. It's a pilot, so we did select 8 organisations, and we had a target of $350,000. We thought maybe in a year would be successful, and I've been blown away by the support. We've had Asylum Seeker Resource Centre put in the first 200,000 as an organisation that was really wanting to support refugee-led organisations. And then recently we've had another foundation, Open Society Foundation, back it up with $200,000. So we've actually exceeded the $350,000 mark. And on top of that, there is a staff member that's going to support the work of the Alliance as well. So we've got $420,000 cash for the work of the Alliance, plus some staffing costs as well, which is fantastic. So to me, I think there's lots to be, there's a lot of work ahead, but the movement, their support for this movement of supporting refugee-led advocacy, refugee-led work. And I encourage organisations or individuals that are here today to really reflect on, one, if you're already doing it, how can you convince others to do it as well? And, you know, think about what more we need to do to ensure that we are sharing space, resources and power with refugee-led organisations and refugee advocates who are individuals as well. So thank you, thanks everyone for joining us today. Until our next AGM, but hopefully hopefully before then we get a chance to meet in person now that, you know, the restrictions are easing. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope you have a great day. Thank you.